Welcome to the Cashflow Academy podcast. I'm Andy Tanner. This is where we do our very best to make investing simple. Great show on deck. Can't wait to introduce this episode's guest. We're going to have a fascinating conversation and an important one, very salient to our times. Before I introduce this special guest, I'll remind you to go to yourinvestingclass.com where we always have goodies and wonderful things, all things investing to enhance your education. And with that, I'm just so excited to introduce to you Brody Mullins. He has written a new book that we're going to be discussing, and the title of the book is called The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. And we'll talk about Too Big to Fail. We'll also talk about Too Big to Bail, possibly. And with that, just welcome to the program, Brody. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Let's start with this. Just a little bit of your background, your journalistic background, your history. Tell us a little bit about how you came to do what you do, and also how you decided to author this book. What motivated you?
Yeah, so I'm one of those strange people who are actually from Washington D.C. There's not many native Washingtonians, so I sort of grew up with politics and journalism kind of in my blood. Both my parents worked for the government. Our next door neighbors worked for the Republican White House, and other neighbors worked for the Democratic White Houses, and chiefs of staff on Capitol Hill. And everyone, Washington D.C. is a company town, and back then the company was the government. It's changed a little bit since then. But anyway, for some reason, I always wanted to go into journalism and into political journalism. In high school, I'd read books about the great presidential campaigns of 1960s and 1980s and before and after, and really sort of loved politics. And for some reason in high school, I decided I wanted to be a reporter. And for an even more bizarre reason, I decided I want to be a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I don't really know exactly why I picked the Wall Street Journal, given that we sort of got the Washington Post at home. But anyway, and the Wall Street Journal, as you know, is a business newspaper. So I sort of gravitated to reading stories about businesses and business and politics. How companies were playing the game in Washington, how industries were playing the game in Washington, which the Journal back then did a great job covering. And I think in general, newspapers covered business in Washington much more years ago than they do now. Now there's almost no coverage of what companies are doing, and we can get into those reasons if you want. But anyway, I sort of decided I wanted to cover business and politics, and I got a job at the Journal after trying for many years, and have covered business and politics and lobbying for 20 years. And all of a sudden, a couple of things happened. I decided, I think this is the right moment to write a book because I have a wife and kids and a job. I realized I needed a partner, and I looked around the room and saw my brother Luke, who is also a reporter in Washington, and we decided to team up. The idea is we both thought we couldn't do a book by ourselves, but together we thought we could, and turns out we did it. We made it, got to the end.
Fantastic. I'm a small-time author, and I've written a couple books and trying to decide scope, and it's never done. You just kind of have to let your editor say, okay, it's done, because you can always keep working. So I've been there a little bit.
It's funny, just to interject for a second. Our book turns out to be 500 pages. Had I known how long the book was going to be, we would have stopped earlier. I was kind of hoping for like a 300-page book. I feel like 500 is too long, but once they print it out and say it's 500 pages, it's too late to go back and cut half of it out. But I should have written 2 books.
Well, I'll tell you, I'd rather have more than less, and I'd rather get more for my money than less. So there you go. Before we dive into the book, just curious you mentioned how journalism changed, and that spurred a question in my mind. It seems to me that it is so important for a consumer to be level-headed and be intelligent, because it seems now that a lot of the news, I don't watch a lot of it anymore, because it seems to me that it is what shall I say? It's telling people what they like to hear, and people get a dopamine hit when they say, yeah, we're right. Those guys are so awful and so evil on the other side. And to me, the difference between Fox News and CNN is nothing. It's just who's pointing fingers at who. And so I think it's really in a state where a reader has to take personal responsibility to filter through all that and really try to find information, because social media and news channels are now finding that they make more money and get more viewership if they cater to a certain opinion, perhaps, than the news. Would you just comment on the state of journalism today? Can you do that without getting in trouble?
Yeah, well, no, I can't, but I'm happy to get in trouble. You're 100% right. It's a sad state of affairs. I think there's a whole bunch of causes for it, but news, particularly television, is now entertainment. I heard a great
Yeah,
anecdote that I probably shouldn't tell, but we'll definitely tell you anyway, about Paul Ryan back when he was Speaker of the House, and maybe this was 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. There's some
yeah,
important budget issue or debt ceiling issue. I don't know the exact issue, but he and Republicans were fighting to get something done. And Sean Hannity on Fox News was was doing some opinion pieces, trashing what Paul Ryan was done. So Paul Ryan said, "Hey," called up the show and said, "Hey, I want to get on the show and rebut this." And so Paul Ryan gets on the show and gives whatever boring argument for whatever he's trying to do. And then Sean Hannity says like the opposite and trashes Paul Ryan. And they go to commercial break, and Paul Ryan says to Hannity, "Hey, what are you doing? What you're saying is completely wrong. These are not your facts are incorrect." And Hannity says to Paul Ryan, "Hey, Paul, relax. It's just entertainment." And that's where
oh my
TV
goodness.
is. And that's,
Yeah,
for the American people, for the public, that's wrong. Another tick on this, you're exactly right. I mean, my wife watches MSNBC, and she's a big liberal Democrat, and that's what she thinks. My brother John watches Fox News, and he's a big conservative Republican, and they can never have a conversation together because they're talking about two completely separate sets of facts. And it just seems like there should be a set of facts down the middle. Like we can disagree, but let's work with the same numbers and the same facts. And unfortunately, the
yes,
media has made that impossible. And so my final point is, you're right. I think smart consumers, just like investing in a stock, you need to do your own analysis. You can't rely
yeah,
on someone else's stock picks, or certainly nothing on television. You have to
yeah.
go out and do your own research and come up with your own opinion. And so
I
many
agree.
people don't do
The
that.
advice the advice culture makes Wall Street rich, and the education culture will make you rich. So very important stuff. So with that, appreciate. Sorry for the digression, because I do want to have the time. I should have asked you before what your. I know what we have scheduled, so maybe there's some flexibility with that. I don't know.
Sure, I got all
You
the time in the world.
okay? I didn't know that you had a hard stop, so that's great. Let's talk a little bit about too big to fail. And well, just talk a little bit about the history of how big money took over government. I mean, that's a very informative subtitle, and it just speaks to power. It speaks to influence. And in investing, everyone's trying to do something that I think is important to try, but mostly futile, which is predict the future. They want a crystal ball. And so, on the one hand, you say, perhaps you could argue that the defining characteristic of the markets is unpredictability. You could argue that. And yet, we can't help but try to predict it. There's three or four ways. Policy and demographics can give you some future. Fed policy matters, debt ceiling policy matters, interest rates, monetary policy matters, fiscal policy. These things are heated and argued about because they shape the future. And so the idea that big money would want to have massive influence over government, I mean, they've been bedfellows for many, many years, but I don't know that they quite formed the cartel that they formed today. So with that, tell us a little bit more about what we're about to read.
Yeah. So the book is called The Wolves of K Street. It's about the rise of corporate power and corporate lobbying in Washington from the 1970s to now. There's a whole bunch of fascinating things in our book, but basically what we're saying is that we're in a period right now where corporations, or large U.S. corporations, have tons of power in government and really have their thumb on the scale, whereas other interest groups like labor unions or environmentalists or public interest groups don't anymore, which is a change actually from about 40 years ago. One of the interesting things we found in our research is that I sort of, growing up in Washington, D.C., seeing all the powerful companies, I always thought that companies were always really dominant in Washington, because you hear about Standard Oil and you hear about, J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers and the railroads and those, industrial titans. And I thought that, well, if companies are powerful now and companies are powerful back then, that they were always powerful. But it turns out that in the turn of the century, we had the trust busting era. We created the Federal Trade Commission. We created antitrust laws, created pro competition laws to put companies sort of back in their place and reduce monopoly power and give power back to consumers. And That worked really well for a long time. FDR and the New Deal, created scores of new laws and regulations in government departments, and all the way up to the Great Society under LBJ, the government was still creating new laws and regulations. And by the way, those laws and regulations were created by Democrats, but they're often supported by Republicans. People
Oh yeah.
forget that EPA was signed into law by Richard Nixon with the support of not only many Republicans, but many companies. So everything sort of worked pretty well for a better part of the century. And then in the 1970s, the economy turned south, and oil prices went up. There was inflation. There was stagflation. Corporate profits were down. Corporations, smart business leaders looked around and said, "Well, what's the problem here?" And they looked at all the money they were paying, shelling out to deal with regulations from the government, and they realized that the government was part of the problem. So,
Mm.
like smart business people, they started investing and fixing their problem. And those investments are hiring lobbyists and making campaign donations to politicians to stop new regulations, to reverse regulations that were already put in place, and to sort of shape regulations in a way that they could deal with. Jumping ahead a bit to your point, though, I think that what we have now is sort of a dominance in Washington and in industry of a few number of large companies. And in almost every industry, there's a small, like, look at banking, there's 5 banks. Look at the airlines, there's 5 airlines. Look at
Yep.
big tech, there's 5 big tech companies, and fewer than 5. I think railroads, we can go on and on and on. And I think that what's interesting now is that companies see Washington not as much of an enemy, but sort of an ally, in that you talked about stability. Companies really don't care if Republicans or Democrats are in power. They just want to know what's happening.
Yeah.
They want the stability. They don't want change. The big companies will say, "Okay, Democrats, give us some regulations. We can work with them, no problem," because the big companies can deal with the regulations. The big companies can afford to have the lobbyists to shape,
Yep.
go back and think about Dodd-Frank, to support regulations that are okay with them, that then create a barrier to entry to the new guys coming in. Again, back to too big to fail and the big banks. I mean, these smaller banks say they can't compete with the larger banks, in part because they can't afford to deal with all the laws and regulations that are just the cost of doing business for the big companies. So it's sort of a
It-
long answer, but it kind of gets to where we are now, where an increasing number of sort of free market populist Republicans in Congress and around the country are saying, "Hey, these companies are too big. The marketplace is not fair anymore. It favors these big companies when they're big lobbyists." And on the left, you have AOC Democrats who are saying the same thing.
it's interesting. My brain, I like to this term called compassionate capitalism, if there's such a thing. There's these ruthless money grubbing, people, and I also think there are some that do a lot of philanthropy and so forth, and have good social conscience in their entrepreneurship. But I worry about government first. When 9/11 occurred, it really exposed the silos and the segregation of the different first responder agencies that were involved. Fire departments struggled to talk to police departments. Police departments struggled to talk to paramedics and hospitals. I mean, it just was all over. And it seemed to me in '07, when '07, '08, '09, when the subprime meltdown occurred, there was some exposure there too in terms of government agencies, particularly in the SEC, where there just was a segregation, a silo of the government inability to regulate. I mean, the government is not what I would call a model of efficiency. You look at the GAO reports, and I don't think we've had a successful audit of the Department of Defense in my lifetime, maybe. I don't know if it goes back that far, but it's pretty far. So, when you have this dance between government and between industry or corporations, doesn't government, since they're setting the rules, got to get their house in order first? And how does that happen? Or can it?
Yeah, that's a thorny question to try to answer. I don't know if it's possible. I think part of the issue is that the government is so big and so complicated that it's sort of, and every different fiefdom. You're right, everything is siloed out. And I think back in the time you're talking about, '07, '08, '09, every regulator thought they were doing their job. They just thought the other regulator wasn't doing their job.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they also, as big as they were, they didn't have insight in what some of these big banks were doing, which is sort of remarkable. So, that was
Yeah.
definitely a failure, in my opinion, a failure of both the government and the marketplace. And it seemed like once that failure uh, occurred and everyone knew, okay, this was a failure, we really didn't do much to fix the problem. We slapped some rules and regulations on the banks, rules and regulations that any bank that's not one of the big ones thinks keeps them out of business. Um, so those rules and regulations serve to protect the biggest companies,
Yeah.
which is sort of amazing. If you're looking at a safe place to put your money, you put them into monopolies, and these guys have a monopoly by a different word. Certainly, huge market concentration and market protection by the government.
Yeah, I wonder how much insulation there is. For example, there's certain companies like Burlington Northern, uh, Berkshire Hathaway came out with their letter, and Buffett says it take almost a half $1 trillion in decades to duplicate that. So they probably are in a position where the little guy, we're not, I don't think I'm going to get my buddy together and say, hey, let's start a railroad and take down Burlington Southern. But I will tell you this, I think in the tech world and in the biotech world with AI, yeah, I look at the obsolescence risk of Netscape or WordPerfect or Quattro Pro
Mm.
or any number, Alta Vista and Yahoo for that example. Their Facebook, even Meta has had to embrace Instagram because Facebook is dying. So there's some opportunity for entrepreneurship where I don't just shrug my shoulders and say, well, Blockbuster Video has it all. They're it. Well, no, actually, they're bankrupt because Netflix just freaking took them out with innovation. So there's probably
Yeah.
some opportunity for that. Let's talk a little bit though. Uh, but to your point, the guy on the king of the hill with all the money, it's not an easy thing. I mean, Apple's got a balance sheet better than most countries in
Yeah.
in this world.
So
Um,
can I interject 2 points here?
please, yeah,
Um,
please.
One, I agree with almost everything you said, especially when it comes to tech. Another company could come in. You said WordPerfect, and I thought, oh man, I love WordPerfect. Whatever happened to WordPerfect? Um, but difference might be Amazon because
Yeah,
it's a tech company, but they really have the distribution network. I mean, they have the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and if
they
you had
do.
that, just finished up reading this great book about Amazon by my colleague Dana Mattioli, and you and I can't start an online retailer to compete with next day delivery because we don't have a next day delivery.
Infrastructure.
We
Yeah.
don't have the
It,
infrastructure. That's one. Another sort of related point is Elon Musk. I mean, I think Elon Musk is a genius. I mean, obviously there's millions of people who hate him and millions of people who love him. He, in my opinion, he's clearly a genius and an entrepreneur and a great American, and he's the most important person in my kid's lifetime, I think. Um,
mm,
but when it comes to SpaceX, he's so good that he's built the monopoly. He has the only rocket that can bring astronauts, supplies, cargo, crew, satellites to space, not just for NASA, which is fun and exciting in terms of scientific missions, but for national security,
yeah.
for our spy satellites. And I mean, Elon Musk is the only person who can bring those to space right now because he built such a good rocket that he basically put the other guys, Boeing and Lockheed, out of business.
Yeah.
So that sort of, I think, sort of gets to kind of the heart of the issue here. He's an incredibly great entrepreneur that he cornered the market and now he's a monopoly, which is bad. I don't know how to fix that without getting the government involved, but it's just sort of an interesting thing to think about.
It certainly is. And monopolies, I remember when I was younger, the first time I really learned about uh, monopolies and breaking things up and antitrust was Ma Bell. When all of a sudden you had one phone company as utility, that was it. And by breaking that up, now my long distance used to pay a lot per minute to. I mean, it was an expensive thing, and so competition absolutely fosters lower prices. It's
I mean,
deflationary for sure.
do you remember those commercials with was it Candace Bergen? 10 Sprint commercials, 10 cents a minute. I'm pretty sure it was 10 cents. Maybe it was a penny, but I mean that's extraordinarily expensive. And they were touting how cheap it
Yeah.
was. 10 cents a minute for a long distance phone call.
Fascinating stuff. Give me some metrics if you have them. Often it's interesting to see the scope of something just by the size of it. For example, the amount of interest we're paying on the national debt now is just frightening. It's staggering. The amount of our budget that simply goes to income security, where we're not investing in any asset. It's absolutely consumable through healthcare or just other pensions. It's just money going out that doesn't really return anything in terms of financial return. I certainly want to take care of people. What is the government lobby numbers like? If you got a 500-page book, I imagine you got a number or two in there. How much money? Well, let me preface it. Now I'm making it too long of a question, but the political campaigns now, it's $1 billion plus to run for president. Like that's astounding to me that it costs that much. What's the lobby like? How much money is going on here?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question because in Washington, in order to get to the truth, you need to get to the numbers. And in the lobbying numbers, the numbers are not clear. And that is because there's two types of lobbyists, as we sort of outline in our book. One is sort of the traditional lobbyist that we think of, the guy handing out campaign checks and in the smoke-filled room, cutting deals with his buddies in Congress. Those types of lobbyists who are paid by companies to talk to members of Congress, they are considered actual lobbyists. The word they use is lobbyist, which is a legal term that applies to people who are paid to try to shape a policy by talking to members of Congress or agency officials. However, a lot of lobbying now has moved out of Washington and is not directly talking to a member of Congress, but trying to get other people to talk to that member of Congress. As in, a lobbyist will go and talk to Senator X and say, "Hey, can you pass this bill to break up big tech?" What most lobbyists are doing now is going out to the country and finding interest groups or citizens and saying, "Hey, can you call your member of Congress and say, break up big tech?" And the reason is that members of Congress are wary now of doing favors for lobbyists. But, in my 20 years covering Washington, the number one thing that a member of Congress does is try to get reelected. So if they're hearing from their constituents to break up big tech, then they're going to break up big tech. And companies know that. So they go to their constituents and say, you saw the ads, not to go back to Amazon, but you saw the ads saying, Congress is trying to do away with Amazon Prime. That's because there was a bill to regulate Amazon that Amazon said would make it harder for them to, do its Prime delivery service. So it went out and rallied consumers and its own customers say, "Hey, Congress is gonna hurt this." So that was Amazon lobbying, but they're lobbying through constituents. So the member of Congress hears, if 100,000 of my constituents call and say, "Don't take my Prime away," and you do that, you're going to lose your reelection. So you don't do that. So anyway, the point is that the number of lobbyists in DC has increased, but not exponentially, because the numbers that we see are only for lobbyists. They're not for the people who go out in the states and run these campaigns to get constituents. So the numbers there are flawed. Another number, though, that's good is the PAC donations from corporate PACs, basically donations from the employees of companies that companies give to members of Congress. And what we saw is that starting in 1974, when PACs were essentially created, at first, members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, took very little money from corporate PACs. And therefore, in the 1970s, members of Congress didn't really care what companies wanted because they were not dependent on them for campaign money. As the cost of campaigns has gone up, both Republicans and Democrats have said, "Where can I get money to fund my campaigns?" And they've found corporate PACs. And corporate PACs have tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars that they give to members of Congress to help their campaigns. And therefore, members of Congress, again, Republicans and Democrats, are dependent on that money. And when they're dependent on that money, they're dependent on what the corporation's, interests are and what they want them to do. A fascinating thing, though, is in about 2016, 15, 17, that started to change. Until about that period, roughly, most members of Congress got most of their money from corporate PACs. That's now changing. And corporations and members of Congress are getting less of their money from corporate PACs. And that's in part because some Democrats are saying, "I'm not going to take corporate PAC money." And some Republicans are saying, "I'm not going to take corporate PAC money." So therefore, corporations have less they make up a smaller share of the campaign money to Republicans and Democrats. And I think no surprise, in the last 5 years, we've seen more and more Republicans and Democrats attacking companies for the first time, or at least not siding with them. And I think that's directly related to their dependence, or in this case, their independence from corporate PAC money. So that's a real trend that we've seen.
Yeah.
And just think about it, if you're a member of Congress, and again, my premise is a member of Congress exists to get reelected. You need money. And if you're not getting that money from corporations, then you don't need them anymore, and you're more willing to attack them. And that was not the case until recently.
So we're speaking with Brody Mullins, the author of The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. We're going to take just a very short pause for a commercial break. And when we come back, I'm going to share the most interesting story I found in this vein that I wrote about. I'm going to ask Brody to share the most interesting thing, the little tidbit. I'm sure there's many of his books. We'll be back in just a moment.
So far, it's been great. I needed a source where I could really enrich my education through stocks. I didn't really have an avenue for it, and it's helped me a lot. The simplicity has really gotten me on the track to where I enjoy the learning, as well as it's really solidifying in my mind. And like, they're not just trying to sell you something, they really care about the people that are in the course, and they really do care about you and your personal goals, and what you want to do is to help you and your family and whatever your goals are in life through that. So it's really been great.
So we're back here. Welcome back to the Cashflow Academy podcast. I'm Andy Tanner, your host. This is where we make investing simple. We're going to continue our conversation with Brody Mullins, the author of The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. And one of the things I think is fascinating about lobbying, and I guess I should see if I've been educated properly. I don't know where I learned this, so it might be apocryphal. I don't know. But the term lobbyist, you had hotels that were adjacent to Washington buildings, and guys would go in there, smoke their cigars in the old days, and hang out. And that's where you would try to catch the ear of government officials in the lobby. And so they were deemed the term lobbyist. And then all of a sudden, like many words, they take on additional form of now a lobbyist is someone who's trying to, get your way with something. It's a rhetorical job. Is that accurate? It's just a crazy.
It's funny. My brother and I, in researching this book, we probably put more time into trying to answer that question than anything else, and we couldn't track it down. Everyone says that that's the story. There was the Willard Hotel, which is a fancy hotel, 200 years old, right next to the White House. And presidents would go, back in the day when presidents sort of leave the White House and go out into town for a cocktail, the presidents would go over to the bar at the Willard, because it was the closest hotel, for a cocktail. And so lobbyists would hang out there, or I guess they were all just corporate executives at the time.
Yeah,
they would hang out there. And when the president would walk in or walk out, they'd say, hey, can you vote for this railroad bill, or vote against this tariff bill, or whatever. Other people say that story is not true, and that the term lobbyist came somewhere in London 50 years earlier. We could never really track it down, but I like the story of the Willard Hotel and lobbyists hanging out in the lobby. I think lobbyists did come from the term lobby. It's just a question of whether it was the Willard Hotel in Washington or somewhere in London in Parliament.
Okay, interesting stuff. But that is the lobby. That is where it comes from. Interesting. I'm going to share a little story that I think is salient to this. Why does someone read The Wolves of K Street? Well, I'll tell you one. There's many reasons, but I'll tell you one reason why. The more educated a person becomes, the more power they have to do two things. You can guide your own life better, I believe, and I think that's more important than ever. Societal change is glacially slow, but it needs to happen. You got to hold the sign of whatever you believe in and march in whatever rally you believe in. But those rallies take a long time for change to come. But you can really change your own life with education. So I think those are two things to keep in mind as a lot of people, after they get done with college, they never read another book in their life. A book a week can do a lot for a person. This is a great study for both of those purposes. Now, I'll give you an example why this is important, I think. I'll give you a little tidbit. I'm not near the journalist or the writer. I'm an imposter writer. That's what I am. I have a hunt and peck style. It's painful. It's awful. Can't spell, no grammar. One of the stories, I wrote a book called 401 Chaos, and one of the stories I found absolutely fascinating, there was a congressman, Honorable Barber, I always get them backwards because they can interchange. And he was in upstate New York, and the lobbyists from Xerox and Kodak came to him, and they said, "Hey, ERISA has put a freeze on some of these bonuses that are deferred by banks. We'd like you to help us. You know, our executives are getting taxed at that time 70% on bonuses. Can we just find a way to pack that away?" So Connerable hired a young staffer from Temple University named Richard Stanger, and he was in his 20s. It was his first job out of college. And he wrote a little section, less than 1,000 words, called Section 401k. It's less than 1,000 words. Had a wonderful anti-discrimination policy in it, so the poor would benefit as the rich. And so they pass it in 1978. In 1980, Ted Benna finds this. He has a bank that needs some help, and he finds this little Section 401k. He says, "You know what? We could use this to defer some of your stuff." Now, when Richard Stanger wrote that in Congress, they ran it through the Ways and Means Committee. They ran it through the IRS and through all the committees to ask this question: how much revenue will be lost or gained if we enact this? Because if we enact this law, we got to know what's going to do to the federal budget and tax. They came back with all these reports, and they said the impact of the 401k law will be less than $1 million annually. Less than $1 million. I about fell out of my chair. 20 years later, Congressman Barber, he wrote a book on his own law, and 401k is not even mentioned. The most resultant legislation of his career, 401k is not even mentioned. And he gets voted as Man of the Year in a mutual fund publication, or Man of the Century, for funding this. And people congratulate him. He says, "Oh, Congressman, look what you've done." He says, did I have anything to do with this? There must be a mistake. He calls up the House Ways and Means Committee, which he chaired, and said, "Did I have anything to do with the 401k at all?" 20 years, the guy has no freaking clue. If that isn't the law of unintended consequences, I have no idea what it is, because now it's global. So I guess what I'm saying is when you have lobbyists and you think, I'm just going to tweak this or tweak that, and next thing, pensions are erased, retirement comes a function of the balance sheet instead of the income statement, the whole world changes. Comments on that, and do you see that often? And then that's my tidbit. Then you get a turn. Give us a couple of great tidbits of what we can read.
Yes, that's an amazing story. I think it sort of shows one, the law of unintended consequences, as you say. I mean, every time Congress passes something, or every time an agency makes a regulation, they think you're making it in a vacuum, but you're
Butterfly, yeah.
encouraging or discouraging behavior, and the marketplace is going to react rationally to that. But another problem here is that a lot of people running Washington and making the laws are really young and have not worked in business or have not, gotten real world experience. And part of that is because, it's a lot of these government jobs are not that high paying, and they take a certain, type of individual who wants to go work in those jobs. And, because they're not high paying, you get very young people who are chiefs of staff and legislative directors, and you're running those committees. And even members of Congress are skewing younger and younger and younger. I mean, for all we do making fun of members of Congress, we're discouraging people from wanting to serve in Congress, which is a shame. A solution is to pass a law to give every member of Congress $1 million pay raise and give staffers $1 million, but that's never going to happen. We're never going to pass we're never going to do that. But that might actually help. It might say hey, we should get smart people who want to go work in government and not work for a hedge fund or a pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, if I'm going to MIT and I graduate after all this work, and Goldman calls, right, or ADM calls, or whoever calls, Micro Devices, or the government calls. Interesting. That's an interesting thing to ponder over.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit more about some of the fun tidbits you found, some of the interesting stories as you wrote.
So the book is obviously chock full of amazing stories that will hopefully blow your mind. But one of them is I talk about how lobbying has changed from the smoke-filled room and the relationship deal, the cozy relationships between lobbyists and members of Congress, to now one where members of Congress respond to their constituents. And the smart lobbyists have figured that out. And one of the lobbyists we write about is a guy named Evan Morris, who worked for a company called Genentech, which is a leading biotech company. Among the many products they make, and they're a very successful company, is Tamiflu, which is used to treat the flu. So about 15 years ago, if you recall, before the real pandemic we had, there was the avian flu scare in Asia. I think a dozen or so people had died. There were some stories on the news about whether this avian flu was going to come to the U.S., whether people would die here, whether this would be a real pandemic like we ultimately had. And the lobbyist for Genentech saw that and decided to sort of fan the flames of that worry. And he thought that if he could get Americans worried about an avian flu outbreak, he could get Congress to do something about it. So he went out and got media stories in red states, some conservative media places, and some liberal media. Back when blogs were just starting, you kind of get anything you wanted out on a blog. And members of Congress read those blogs and thought, oh my gosh, like my constituents are worried about this. I should do something.
Oh my goodness.
So, and those members of Congress weren't no-name people. They were Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden are people who signed on to a bill that would create a stockpile of avian flu treatments. So Congress ended up passing a law, and the Bush administration signed it, creating a $2 billion stockpile of avian flu treatments. And then the government said, okay, we've got this $2 billion. Who makes the best avian flu treatment? And the Genentech lobbies, I do. I'm the only in town. I've got Tamiflu. So the government bought $2 billion worth of Tamiflu to treat this pandemic that never happened.
With our money.
With our money, right. And I bet, somewhere in Washington, D.C., you could find some enormous closet that's stuffed with $2 billion worth of Tamiflu that's never been used.
Someone's garage has got it's like they need to start a multi-level and distribute it out to everyone else's garage.
Exactly. Well, to make story a little bit worse, one of the things that this bill did that was passed with the help of the company lobbyists was to create stockpiles in states also, so that they were distributed. So that's already taken care of.
Okay.
But it's really sort of a sad story of how because members of Congress now rely so much on what they think their constituents want. If you can manipulate those constituents, you can get what you want out of a member of Congress.
This actually is so insightful because it creates, that's kind of a case study perhaps of one of the biggest problems we have, because with social media and the ability for anyone to say anything now more than ever, you have a battle with free speech. Say whatever you want, or no, you can't do misinformation. I mean, can you yell fire in a theater? How far does that go now, right? Because I'm a huge free speech guy, like massive free speech guy. And on the other side of that, we have so much conspiratorial thinking that as soon as you point to someone that's making any kind of money, must be dirty because there's money motivated. And so yet here's a case study where, they conspired to do this. And so, God, the almighty dollar, if we could just get a handle on this and be good people, it'd be a lot better for sure. But what a fascinating story. And it really speaks to, well, it's almost full circle of what we started the show with, is as a consumer of information in the information age, just as I would be discerning with my diet, well, maybe more discerning than me. I almost named my sons Ben and Jerry, but my wife wouldn't have it. But as we discern our intake of food, perhaps we become equally discerning in our intake of information and really discriminate and investigate, be skeptical, but not tinfoil hat. I mean, boy, what a great book. What an exciting thing. I'm sure it took, how long did it take you how long have you been working on it?
Tough question for my family and I. I think we started in 2017. It's hard to tell because I'd written a couple stories for the Wall Street Journal that kind of became this book. So do we count it as, that when I started on those stories or later? We didn't sign a book deal until right before the pandemic, so in early 2020. But it's been a long time. And one of the things our editor said to us, which was great, our editor at Simon & Schuster said, hey, you're writing about an era. You're writing about a period in time. You're writing about history. Don't rush it. It's not a book about Donald Trump or about Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. We don't need to speed this up. This is it. This is a moment that's incredibly important. So take your time. So anyway, the point is, we took our time, and it was a long time.
Back to that idea of predicting the future, I said one of the ways to do it is you look at policy and the demographic, and that can point to some real future. Another way to predict the future is history often repeats itself. And so if you want to know the future, study the past and do it intently, because human beings evolve very, very slow. It took us 200,000 years to get to where we are now, right? And we're not going to change that much. And so if you can learn about human behaviors and learn about history, it can often tell you what it will likely be like in the future. You have been so gracious with your time. I've enjoyed this conversation intently. Everyone, you can go to Amazon, you can go to fine booksellers, Barnes and Noble, anywhere. Just out, just able to get it, be one of the first to read it. And those of you that listen to the podcast regularly know what's coming. My audience knows how I sell books on my podcast, and I do it unapologetically, because I wouldn't have a guest on if I didn't feel he was worth introducing to at least our listenership. And if you were to have the opportunity to take Brody to dinner and pick up the tab to pick his brain for an hour, that would cost you more than going to Amazon.com and get to pick his brain for what he's been working on for the past 6-7 years. So I recommend it. Go to Amazon, go to Barnes and Noble, whatever it is. Educate yourself. Last question on education. I tend to end my podcast with this question traditionally, because I'm always curious about, I'm biased. I'm an education advocate, so I'm always going to give the answer. Get smarter and your life's better. But as we talked about being educated as an electorate, unfortunately, I don't have as much faith in that. I think people, they want dopamine hits. They don't want the rigor of learning, often. I think a person's best bet is to, I think we have to have a good social construct, but if you really want to do well in life, you've got to take the bull by the horns and say, it's my freedom, my life. I got to be as smart as I can get. I can't trust government to take care of me. There is no government policy that has the horsepower to overcome an ignorant personal policy. And conversely, there's probably no horrible, awful government policy that can keep down the horsepower of an individual who's ready to roll. So with that said, what's your thought on the state of education, in the electorate? How do you feel about, what do people really know about this topic? If we went jaywalking and put a mic in front of someone, would they know anything about this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. In fact, one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out if I can get this book taught in political science classes around the country. So I think, at least when I took political science classes, you learn about the 3 branches of government. You learn about, Congress makes the laws and the president signs them into law and
interprets them in the judicial.
Yeah. And then you learn about, well, the media's got a role here in influencing that. But we don't learn is that another branch of the government, unfortunately, is corporations and their power and their lobbyists. We have a couple of examples in the story, in the book, that I won't get into right now, that, how popular presidents were pushing proposals that were supported by Congress and had a majority support of the country. And corporate lobbyists came in and crushed them. And that, to me, means if the corporate lobby is more powerful than a president of the United States, then they should be taught, then political science students and Americans should be taught about their influence and their power, because they have just as much, if not more, impact on Americans' lives than the presidents themselves.
It's a yin and yang that I've thought about a lot in my life, and I try to have my mind open to balance. I found in my life, at least, when you have a good balance, things tend to work out. And if you have too much government, it's a nightmare because you lose your freedom. But if you abuse your freedom, then you're going to lose them. And if you abuse those freedoms, pretty soon you're not allowed to have them anymore. So there's got to be a balance. And to me, it's more cultural even than political. is if you have good culture, that's more powerful. You know, a company with good culture, that's more powerful than your SOPs. A good church that is culturally good is more important than the, pastors, given hellfire damnation. So hopefully a book like this also improves the culture of how we think and become informed. With that, I thank you, Mr. Brody Mullins from the Wall Street Journal. Also a interesting a publication I recommend. When a new investor has never done it before, say, Andy, what do you read? I go, I don't subscribe to read anything but the journal. I read the journal, and that's the only subscription I really have. Other than that, I read books like The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. I thank you so much. Please hang on for a bit so I can properly thank you after we close the show. You've been listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast. Drop by yourinvestingclass.com for some of the goodies we have, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.